Thursday marks World Press Freedom Day. Just days ago, 2 suicide bombers in Afghanistan killed at least 29 people, including several journalists. It's one of the most lethal attacks ever on the press worldwide. So why are journalists increasingly becoming a target? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. It is becoming ever more risky to be a journalist in today's world. 2 attacks in Afghanistan earlier this week killed at least 9 journalists. The UN has documented the killing of 14 journalists there since last year alone. But the issue is not unique to that country. Reporters from North Korea to Syria, Turkey and Eritrea face threats every day. According to the World Press Freedom Index, North Korea ranks at the bottom, while Norway, Sweden and the Netherlands round up the top 3. But Europe has seen the steepest decline in the regional rankings. Malta is now ranked 65th, down by 18 points, and Slovakia 27th, down by 10. In both countries, high-profile journalists were recently murdered. The US has slipped 2 places to 45th. The report partly blames what it calls violent rhetoric from President Trump. Myanmar, which has forced out hundreds of thousands of Rohingya, has also slipped. It's now ranked 137th, with the government intensifying arrests and prosecutions of journalists. The Middle East and North Africa has been rated the worst region for journalists. Rights groups have reported an unparalleled crackdown on Egypt's media in recent years. Among those in jail, Al Jazeera journalist Mahmoud Hussein has been in prison for nearly 500 days without charge. And near the bottom of the list are Iraq, Syria and Yemen. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mohammed El-Bardisi on what it's like to be a journalist in Yemen.
Yemen is a country that's been torn apart by war and suffering. The UN calls it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And those telling its stories are increasingly finding themselves at risk.
After the coalition's intervention, the Houthis started going after journalists intensively, especially after the Houthi leader's speech calling for the targeting of journalists and deeming them more dangerous than fighters.
Ma'rib Ward is a Yemeni journalist who was forced to leave the capital Sana'a after being targeted by Houthi rebels for his coverage of the war. He says he had to escape the southern city of Ta'iz for safety.
The Houthi media published my name, along with other journalists, calling us coalition supporters, only for doing our jobs. By doing that, they increased the threat on our lives and trapped our movements. If the Houthis were to spot us, our fate would be uncertain. You would be fortunate to be kidnapped.
Journalists covering the conflict in Yemen face kidnapping, raids, and missile strikes. In December last year, 41 journalists from Yemen TV were held hostage after Houthi forces stormed the building. Human rights groups have accused both Houthi rebels and coalition forces of targeting journalists. Yemen's media union says Saudi-led coalition airstrikes have killed at least 120 journalists since the start of the war 3 years ago.
Saudi airstrikes have killed 120 journalists over the past 3 years. These airstrikes have also caused total and partial destruction of over 200 TV and radio stations, as well as newspaper headquarters.
Journalist Ahmed Al-Ghubari was concerned his wedding would be targeted.
Saudi-led coalition have been targeting wedding parties since the beginning of the war. So it is not something new, and people now afraid from doing wedding parties. Like me, I got married 1 month ago, and my mom told me, don't do a wedding party.
Ma'rib continues to work where he can. His life remains restricted to the city of Ta'iz, where he's free to report. But if he ventures elsewhere, he'll likely face being kidnapped or even killed. Mohammed El-Bardisi, Al Jazeera.
Let's now get the thoughts of our guests in Gaza. Sami Abu Salam, a freelance journalist for Wafa National News Agency. He is also a member of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. Joining us on Skype from Manila, Benjamin Zawaki, Southeast Asia analyst and human rights advocate, and also on Skype from Paris, Christophe Deloy, Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders. Christophe is a former investigative reporter and author. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Deloy, why is global press freedom in a worse state than it was last year, with a record number of countries now being classified as having very bad freedom of the press?
For three main reasons. In war zones, in areas that are also supposed to be in peacetime, but sometimes with a lot of weapons against journalists are targeted. And really all the warriors there, they want journalists to leave the floor. The second reason is that in despotic countries, the control on information is worse because there are a lot of countries where the despotic regimes, that's in China, that's in Egypt, in other ones, they want really to suppress absolutely the right for independent investigation. And third, in democracies, there's an increase of intimidations, of hatred against journalists that is spread in the Philippines, even in the United States, and even in European countries.
Mr. Abisalim, would you agree with the report? Is it harder for you now to do your job as a journalist covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than it has been in the past?
Yeah, definitely, actually. And one of the reasons is that the Israeli soldiers are enjoying immunity. Nobody can punish them. Actually, it is a... And one of the main reasons is the racist policy they are practicing. For example, as they announced, Israel does not consider that Palestinians in general worthy life. That's why they are targeting everybody, including journalists. And it is clear when the Israeli Minister of Army, Lieberman, said that there are no innocent Palestinian, no innocent people in Gaza. No innocent people in Gaza. People, which means anybody, even children and anybody, including journalists, of course. That's why the Israeli snipers murdered and shoot Palestinian civilians, including journalists, without any feeling that anybody could punish them, which means that Israel is a state above law.
And Mr. Abisalim,
they don't care about
the killing of journalists that you're referring to, the ongoing protests that we've seen at the Gaza-Israeli border over the last 6 weeks. Tomorrow, Friday, will mark 6 weeks since these protests began. We've seen the killing of 2 journalists in these protests and the injuring of many more. So what challenges have you been facing as a journalist in covering the ongoing protests? And have the deaths and the injuries deterred you and other journalists from doing your job?
Definitely, on the personal level, after the murdering Yasser Murtaja by an Israeli sniper, a cameraman, and Ahmed Abu Hussein, also a reporter, they have been murdered by Israeli sniper near the border, and 10 others have been wounded. On the personal level, I hesitate to cover anymore. I mean, last Friday, for example, I did not cover the events because I was afraid. I'm so scared. I'm scared that my kids will be orphans, or I will lose one of my limbs. 21 people lost their limbs because of the Israeli shootings. In addition, regarding difficulties or challenges, I think we have no other choice just to continue our covering. First of all, it is our source of living. Number 2, we have no other choice. Number 3, nobody can put any pressure on the Israeli soldiers or on the Israeli military to stop targeting journalists.
And we will get to what more can be done and what more governments can and should do to protect journalists a little bit later in the program. But I'd like to bring Benjamin Zawaki in from Manila now. The Middle East and North Africa, Mr. Zawaki, the worst region for press freedom. As we mentioned, Al Jazeera journalist Mahmoud Hussein has been in an Egyptian jail for 500 days on Friday without charge. Egypt is 161st on the list of 180 countries. Is Hussein's case an example of the government's treatment of journalists?
Yes, it is. It's an example of not only Egypt's treatment of journalists, but this is true not only in North Africa, in the Middle East, but in Southeast Asia as well. And in some respects, journalists are simply those with their heads highest above the parapet. What this really is, these attacks on journalists, attacks on the press and on the media, are really attacks on transparency in open societies, right? They're essentially governments fearing what they would term as exposure. They fear a transparent society in which their deeds are exposed to the wider public, because with exposure ultimately could come accountability. And so they're essentially demonizing those out in front of this movement, the journalists themselves, the media, those that take the risks to investigate, to analyze, to expose very politically inconvenient and sometimes dangerous facts about what their governments are doing. But at the end of the day, this is less a matter of simply press freedom, but rather freedom for people to exercise their rights in an ever-shrinking democratic space. This is true in autocratic governments as far away as the United States, and certainly around this region, in Cambodia, the Philippines, Myanmar, Thailand. The list goes on of increasingly autocratic governments that have less and less tolerance for transparency, and to take that intolerance out on the press.
As you mentioned, Southeast Asia has seen a decline in press freedom, but Mr. Dalwa, the hostility that we're talking about towards the media is not restricted to these authoritarian regimes. As Mr. Zawaki mentioned, the US has fallen again in the index under President Donald Trump, 2 places to 145th. I mean, this is a president who's openly hostile to the media and calls it enemies of the people.
Now the United States are ranked 45th out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index, because that's a country where, as you said, the president uses a word that even a despot like Stalin used in Moscow dozens of years ago. And that's really worrying that such words, such insults against journalists are used by the president of the United States, because for many people in the world, this country has set up an example for press freedom. It has been a priority of the diplomacy to expand press freedom, even if, of course, in some countries, for diplomatic reasons, it wasn't such the case. But what we have to notice is that this phenomenon in the United States is not limited to Trump. Of course, there are some reasons to be obsessed with Donald Trump. But if we go and investigate in smaller cities, not just in Washington, D.C. or New York City, if we go into the country and ask people, as journalists, they will say to you that there is a Trumpization of the common spirit in such regions, that many journalists face problems to investigate, that the Freedom of Information Act that was really an example for the rest of the world is not now really implemented, that there are more and more arrests during arrests of journalists, during demonstrations. There's really something that is beyond Trump himself.
Yes, so it's happening across America, maybe because of an example being set by the president. And Mr. Zawaki, if we have, the so-called leader of the free world using this kind of rhetoric towards the media, it's being repeated around the world, because you have the Philippine president saying something like, not only insulting reporters, but is warning them that they're not exempt from assassination. You had the Czech president who showed up to a press conference with a fake Kalashnikov saying 4 journalists on it.
Right, although I will say that it's something of a misconception that these autocratic governments, be they democratically elected or otherwise, dislike the press on a monolithic basis. Because, in fact, they'll be the first to welcome the press and to lay out the red carpet and call a press conference in order to promote a government initiative or champion a government project or call success to a foreign policy, for example. What they really don't like is analysis and, frankly, facts, real facts that run counter to the narrative they're trying to put forth. Fake news is a reality, and yet the Trump administration has largely successfully co-opted the term, redefined the term to essentially mean news with which he disagrees, news that he finds politically inconvenient or personally offensive, to the point where, to use another Southeast Asian example, you have Malaysia passing a law about fake news and being essentially toward the purpose of utilizing such a law for electoral purposes. And to your point, feeling increasingly justified in doing so because the leader of the free world is doing the same thing in America. Trump doesn't hate the media. He embraces Breitbart News. He embraces Fox News. He simply dislikes the media and demonizes the media that he finds politically problematic.
And Mr. Delwa, we've seen a dislike of the media in what is regarded as the world's best region for press freedom in Europe. We've seen 2 journalists killed in the past year. We've seen a Maltese journalist and a Slovakian journalist murdered.
Yeah, there are the cases, the fact that there were 2 assassinations, but also there's the climate, the environment in which those cases took place. And we have to say that in many countries, journalism has been weakened by what leaders say, and sometimes but by what parts of the population also think. So that's today a mobilization of all democracies worthy of this name that has to be organized inside the European Union, but of course beyond. And we have also to notice that there are good examples. Countries where things are now better. I don't know. For instance, in Gambia, in Africa, where the press freedom predator left the power, and with the new president, things are really much better. That's also the case in Ecuador, in South America, or in South Korea with the President Moon. So those democracies, and sometimes Southern democracies, they set up a very good example that we have to follow, that in fact, at the end, the fight for press freedom is really political.
And they have...
Not are you on the right or on the left. Yeah. We have really to fight to set up political references.
And there have been silver linings in the past year, Mr. Zawaki. The death of the Slovakian journalists ended up in mass protests that led to the resignation of the government. The murder of the Maltese journalist has resulted in a consortium of international journalists coming together to continue her investigative work under Project Daphne.
Yes, it's really incumbent upon not just individual journalists, but the journalistic profession and the media to fight back. You think about the founding of Al Jazeera, founded to essentially put forth an alternative analysis of the way in which mainstream media outlets were otherwise analyzing the global news. And an alternative analysis is perfectly legitimate. But what Al Jazeera has not sought to do is to tamper with well-established facts. And that's where those are grounds that shouldn't be strayed into. I mentioned this because China is in the process of forming something called the Voice of China that will essentially be a consolidation of state-backed and state-supported news outlets and media outlets that will almost certainly do exactly that. Rather than just put forth an alternative analysis, which I think the world would welcome, it will indeed question well-established facts in an attempt to alter the narrative in such a way that what the world is getting is not the truth, but is the truth as seen through the political lens of the Communist Party of China. And so as these developments take place, it really is incumbent upon the journalistic community to fight back with factual stories and with analysis that holds up under scrutiny.
Mr. Sami Abu Salem, what can the journalist community do to fight back other than what it's already doing, covering Gaza, covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And what more needs to be done to put pressure on the Israeli government to respect the rule of law, to respect journalists' rights to work covering conflicts?
I think that the first thing that Palestinian journalists can do is to avoid danger and to put in their considerations that they are a target for the Israeli snipers. Number two, I think that the Palestinian journalists are in need for practical support by international organizations like Reporters Without Borders or International Federation of Journalists or any other organizations. I mean, we as journalists on the ground, I can see we thank those organizations very much about their statements, but I am not a lawyer, but I do not know how to bring those who killed Palestinian journalists last week, who killed Yasser Murtaja and Ahmed Abu Hussein, how to bring them to the court. It is something legal and political. From the legal side, if they can sue the Israeli suspected to be criminals who targeted the Palestinian journalists, and if they could help us to put pressure on Israel to allow the entry of flak jackets and helmets and equipments for safety. Because I personally, tried to let about 20 flak jackets, and the Israeli authorities did not allow. Why? I do not know. That's why I hope that those organizations, they are respected organizations, support the Palestinian journalists on the ground in Gaza or in the West Bank, to support them with more practical steps, something more than denouncing.
Mr. Dalwa, what do you make of that?
No, I perfectly agree. Denouncing is not enough. It can help to exercise pressure on some governments, but that's not enough for sure. What is really useful, and one of the assets we have, because of course, in front of weapons, in front of jails, in front of despotic regimes, what are the assets of journalists? I do not mention their courage, of course, but what are the concrete assets? One of the assets the protection of journalists is international law. A lot of resolutions have been adopted by various UN bodies, such as the Security Council, the General Assembly, etc. What we want is the international law to be implemented. We need a new position to be created in the United Nations, a special advisor, a special representative to the Secretary General of the UN, to be able to verify the compliance with the international law, to be able to exercise pressure on stakeholders. But we also have other possibilities on filing lawsuits. And so that's why we first ask for independent investigations. And second, if needed, we file lawsuits.
Mr. Zawaki, I don't think any of the journalists that have been murdered, who we've spoken about in this program, that their killers have been held to account. So what more, apart from what Mr. Abu Salem and Mr. Dalwa are suggesting, can and should be done, especially by governments? And as the UN Secretary General on World Press Freedom Day said that governments must do more to protect journalists.
Well, there must be consequences. Essentially, at the end of the day, the rap on international law is that it's not real law until and unless it is enforced. And so when you have journalists as the victims of extrajudicial execution, arbitrary detention, other violations of their rights, until and unless other governments step in and actually penalize countries for failing to protect those journalists, or in some cases for perpetrating the crimes against them, these crimes will continue. And I think one of the things that's most necessary to simply continue doing their jobs, to continue getting the stories, protecting their sources, ensuring that their analysis holds up. One of the best ways to protect and promote and defend human rights is simply to continue exercising those rights and not to be cowed by the intimidation that a lot of governments attempt to implement. Moreover, it needs to be mentioned that at least for several decades now, the amount of funding that has gone to journalism has decreased. In Southeast Asia, the 15 years that I've been here, far fewer full-time foreign correspondents seem to be roaming the capitals and roaming the countryside, in large part on account of funds.
I'm afraid that we are coming to the end of our program and we don't have much time left, so I just want to ask one very short question to our guest in Gaza. Mr. Abu Salem, will you be going back out to the Gaza-Israel border on Friday to cover the ongoing protests?
Last Friday I did not go, but this Friday I think I'm going because I have no other choice. I think so, but I will be so curious because I'm sure that I am a target just because I'm a journalist and because I am a Palestinian. Because I'm a journalist and because I'm Palestinian. And I repeat what Lieberman said, what the Israeli army minister said, there are no innocent people in Gaza, which means that he is justifying the killing of journalists or any other civilians. That's why I hope Reporters Without Borders and any other international organizations like International Federation of Journalists or CPJ in New York, I hope them to hold training courses for Israeli officers to teach them how to be human and how to deal with Palestinians as a human.
Mr. Abu Salam, thank you very much for that. That is Sami Abu Salam joining us live from Gaza, Benjamin Zawaki in Manila, and Christophe Delois in Paris. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.